Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone doing? Great. Yay. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us here in the lovely Grand Salon. This afternoon, we are privileged, ladies and gentlemen, to have with us Mr. Andrew Johnson, who is a frequent speaker here on Seaborn. Andrew is not only a speaker, but also an avid cultural observer, a world traveler. He is a strategic business consultant around the world, internationally, right, Andrew? He's going to tell you all about his experience. Ladies and gentlemen, he's lived 20-something years outside Valencia in Spain and has just recently relocated to the smallest cathedral town in England. Did I get that right? Amazing, ladies and gentlemen. And this afternoon, he's going to be talking to you all about tea beyond the Tea Party, how tea spread around the world. So without any further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Andrew Johnson.
Cece, thank you very much. And to you all, happy Leif Erikson Day. I know you've been waiting for the opportunity to celebrate. I'm not going to talk about Leif Erikson, who I'm sure you all remember was one of the earliest Europeans to set foot on North American soil. In fact, in the Canadian Maritimes, where we're heading now. But I'm not going to talk about him today because on Saturday we celebrate Columbus Day. Okay, it's portable in some places, it's been renamed in some places, but on Saturday I'm going to talk about the explorers, how America might have been discovered, how it was discovered, and more importantly, some of the legacy, some of the impacts of the global exploration and the development of trade around the world. One of the aspects of trade around the world is what I'm talking about today, and that's the development of the trade in tea. Well, actually, the development of the trade in tea and opium. We have quite a lot of options for you to taste tea on board. I understand the options to try opium on board are more limited, but maybe you need to speak to Dr. Tim about that if you feel the need. Boston is famous for a lot of aspects from its history, its culture, art, geography, and so on. But one that I guess all of you will have seen yesterday, even if you only passed it, is the story of the Boston Tea Party, because we crossed one of the bridges by the Tea Party ship. That was in 1773. I want to look at what was happening on the other side of the world and what continued to happen on the other side of the world and its impact on North America and Europe as the trade in tea developed, and how England tried to capitalize on that trade in tea by imposing taxation that some people seem to object to. But we'll come to that. So the influence of tea continues and will continue, I'm sure. Now, in 1660, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the British East India Company, which was based in the City of London. Just remember the City of London. It was originally chartered as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The company was to rise to become effectively the controller of some of the largest parts of the British Empire. It controlled basic commodities, silk, porcelain, dye, salt, spices, even saltpeter, all of which were important to trade and to manufacture and to the improving life in the UK, but also tea and opium. The company controlled a lot of the trade in Southeast Asia. It controlled a lot of the trade here on this side of the Atlantic through various other organisations, and it ruled the beginnings of the British Empire before it was controlled from Westminster, because the British Empire was effectively a commercial enterprise in its earliest days. By the time of the Boston Tea Party, some 900 tons of opium were being smuggled into China from Bengal by the company and by other traffickers to allow tea to be exported from China, so sent in exchange. And most of the money needed to buy tea in China was raised by the illegal trade in opium. So let me tell you a little bit about me and why it's relevant for me to discuss this issue today. Originally, my background was in the travel industry. I then moved into the automobile clubs, and you will know, particularly those of you from North America, will know that travel is an integral part of the automobile club's activities. I ended up as president and CEO of the European equivalent of the AAA of North America. Turnover of about 2 million. We employed 30,000 people, serving around 67 million motorists in 37 countries, which means we have to deal with legal, financial, fiscal issues in 37 plus different regimes. In terms of my expertise, well, I trained as an economist. I have an interest in behavioral sciences. I'm a life coach and mentor. I am a Lord's Taverner, hence the tie, and I'm happy to explain that to anyone who has any interest to know what that means. But I am also a freeman, indeed a liveryman of the City of London. As a liveryman of the City of London, I am part of the small electoral college that appoints the Lord Mayor of London, the successors of Dick Whittington, and the sheriffs of London as well. And London, the City of London, this is I'm talking here about the square mile City of London, which controls finance and insurance in so many aspects around the world. Lloyd's of London, for example, is the major insurance market for the world. Boeing insure with Lloyd's of London. Carnival insure with Lloyd's of London. And so do many other corporations. And the City of London was integral in this story because of the establishment of the East India Company. Now, I have a real interest in language, how people choose to use my language, for example. And a friend sent me this sign, which I think is rather good. He saw it in Savannah, Georgia, and it says, "Save the Earth, it's the only planet with wine." On the other hand, I saw this, a no-chew deterrent, which the dogs seem to have different views on. So, tea didn't begin in Africa, and indeed, as seaborne ships sail around the world, they touch on many of the characters from my story, in that they touch on the places where many of those people were. The China Seas, New York, Boston, large parts of Africa. Tea didn't begin in Africa or India or the Philippines or Thailand or Malaysia or the Carolinas or Sri Lanka. But most of our tea today comes from those places. For the origins, we have to go back many centuries and into Asian waters, and particularly the China Seas. The actual origin of tea as a drink isn't recorded in history, only in legend. But it's certain that it began in ancient China 5,000 years ago. The story goes that an early emperor named Shen Nung was visiting a distant part of his kingdom. He had an interest that was to lead through serendipity to a passion around the world. He was a scientist, and he had a great belief in the purity of what he ate and drank. So any water that he drank had to be boiled before it would be drunk. And one day his staff were boiling water in the open air, and leaves from a plant of the chamomile family blew down into the water and infused the water. He looked at this new coloured liquid and decided to taste it. and found it was very refreshing. So, as the narrative goes, that is how tea was born. Thousands of years, the tea culture has spread through Chinese life. But it wasn't until the year 800 that the scholar Lu Yu wrote the first definitive book on the subject, which was called Cha Qing, the Book of Tea. Lu Yu was an orphan. He was raised by Buddhist monks, and this was in one of China's finest monasteries. He was both a rebel and a skilled observer, and he achieved some acclaim as a performer. The Japanese Buddhist priest, Yesei, took the first seeds of the tea plants, the chamomile, back to Japan. And he was thereafter known throughout Japan as the father of tea. The subtly captivating qualities of tea were very well received among members of the royal court. Various monasteries and other sections of Japanese society started to adopt it as a way of celebrating and enjoying. And since that time, tea in Japan has always been associated with Zen Buddhism. The Japanese influence was well known, and the Japanese tea ceremony, which I'm sure if you've been to Japan you have witnessed or taken part in, that was created to celebrate the joy of tea. The ceremony is called the Chanoyu, which translates as hot water for tea. It requires years of training, years of practice. And even though it was reported, the whole art signifies no more than the making and serving of a cup of tea, the supremely important matter is that the act be performed in the most perfect, most polite, most graceful, and most charming manner possible. The ceremony's greatest practitioners have been philosophers, but also artists, connoisseurs, collectors, gardeners, calligraphers, gourmets, flower arrangers. All of them have used tea as a way of communicating and relaxing with clients, with partners or whatever. Now, the greatest of these philosophers, Senrikyo, left a tantalizingly simple set of instructions, which I will read. He said, to make a delicious bowl of tea, lay the charcoal so that it heats the water, arrange the flowers as they are in the field. In summer, suggest coolness. In winter, warmth. Do everything ahead of time, prepare for rain, and give to those with whom you find yourself. Tea came to Europe and to the Americas really quite slowly. At first, people heard of it. There were rumors, there were whispers, and the first Europeans to take tea and to document it were Portuguese. A Jesuit father, Jasper de Cruz, is the first to have recorded tasting it. And this was in the 1550s, so really quite late in the history of tea. He was a missionary visiting China, and the Portuguese developed the first trade route, shipped tea to Lisbon. The enterprise was then repeated by the Dutch, and the Dutch introduced tea to France, and it then came to France, to the Netherlands, to New Amsterdam, and beyond. Of course, at the time, tea in Europe and America was very expensive and very special. It was kept in locked caddies, in the way that a lord of the manor, I guess, might keep his most expensive whiskies or wine today. Tea was kept in locked boxes, locked caddies, and only served in the best china cups, and certainly the staff of the house wouldn't be allowed to drink it themselves. They were only allowed to prepare it and serve it. And originally, tea was served in bowls which came themselves from China or Japan. Now, some of you may remember the Nanking cargo, named after the type of porcelain in the Dutch East India Company's ship, the Geldermalsen. It sank near Java in 1751. It was salvaged in 1985, and the cargo was sold by Christie's in Amsterdam. There were 2,800 lots, In May 1986, they went under the hammer and raised some 20 million US dollars. I don't know whether they would be controlled by the import restrictions that Robert was talking about this morning. I guess it depends which of those countries they came from. But in time, companies like Wedgwood and Sèvres and Meissen started to copy the Chinese and Japanese tea bowls and make their own as cups. And in time, they added handles to them and saucers, and we end up with the cup and saucer pattern that we are used to today. So how did tea come to be served in North America? Well, it was this man, Peter Stuyvesant. He lived at the very end of the 16th century, well into the 17th century, and he took the first tea to the colonies in the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. And you know, of course, New Amsterdam is what today we refer to as Manhattan or New York, and it was exchanged with England for the spice island of Rum in Southeast Asia. The Dutch settlers were avid tea drinkers, and it was discovered at the time that the English acquired a colony that this relatively small settlement was consuming more tea than the whole of England. And this was to lead to the story that you probably heard yesterday in Boston, because England worked out that tea was so important to these people that they could charge them heavily through taxation for access to it. And of course, the no taxation without representation protests led to the Boston Tea Party, and I guess one of the most famous tea-related incidents in history. But I'm not going into the political background of that. The age of the tea clippers lasted only 2 decades, but this brief reign was marked by some real excitement and enthusiasm for the ships and their cargo. And it's gone down in legend, not just in history, famed for their glamour and the romance. And part of that is because it became an opportunity for quite substantial gambling and speculation. Excuse me. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company, remember the company set up by the City of London, properly called the Honourable East India Company by this time, had the monopoly on British trade with China and with India, because no other company could legally import goods from these countries. And so the company was rarely in a great hurry to get the tea back to London or to New York or to wherever it was importing it. In fact, its priority was to minimize the cost by carrying as much as possible on each ship. And of course, that then slowed down the journey time. By 1800, the average East India man could carry 1,200 tons of cargo, East India men being the names of the ship, the style of ship. The pattern, the trading pattern, was for ships to sail from Britain in January, right the way down the west coast of Africa around the Cape, and then to head off across the Indian Ocean and up to the China seas. To arrive in China in September, they would then load the year's harvest and set off again on the return journey. Now, depending on the wind and the weather, they would aim to arrive back in Britain by the following September. So it was effectively a 2-year journey cycle from Europe to China and back again. And of course, if anything went wrong, it could end up taking quite a lot longer. By 1834, the company had lost its trading monopoly, and tea had become a freely traded item. Because they no longer needed their ships, because they no longer had the monopoly, these were sold off to individual traders who continued to plough the high seas, but who wanted to get their merchandise back sooner. There was more urgency so that each new harvest would get back as soon as possible, because the first person or the first organisation to get their tea back to London, for example, or New York or Amsterdam, could charge a premium on the New Year crop. Now, this was partly because of practicalities. If you were home first, you could sell your shipment of tea before the competitors had even arrived. And partly consumers in the 19th century believed that the fresher and earlier picked the tea, the better the resulting drink. It probably wasn't true, but even then, marketing was really important. And the big lumbering ships, the clippers, the East Indiamen, became less attractive because they were so slow. However, the idea caught on slowly to find faster ways, and the 1840s saw a few faster ships launched. For the time being, many merchants remained satisfied, though, with the slower ships and the lower returns that they would get. The first true tea clipper was Rainbow, this one here, which was designed and launched in 1845. She made the journey from New York to Canton in 102 days, less than 4 months, taking more than 2 weeks off the previous record for that trip. The development was given another boost by the discovery of gold in California in 1848 and in Australia in 1851. People rushing to seek their fortunes wanted to get there as fast as possible, and they would pay a premium to travel on faster ships. After this, the clippers were designed and built in America and Britain throughout the 50s and 60s. The British craft were slightly different from the American ones. British craft had a narrower beam, which made them less powerful in heavy weather, but faster in lighter seas. There was a lot of competition, especially between the British and American ships who were plying their trade. But in the early days, without any doubt, the American ships had the edge. Then in 1851, the British ship owner Richard Green announced that he was going to do something about this. He was sick of hearing how great the American shipping companies were. And with the repeal of the navigation laws, he built the aptly named clipper, the Challenger. And his stated intention was to beat the American ships. Leaving Canton for London in 1852, loaded with tea, she fell in with the American clipper, Challenge. Challenger from Britain, Challenge from America. Challenge was a much larger ship, but older, already greatly admired for her speed. She had broken many records, and large sums of money were bet on which of these two ships would make it back to London first. In the event, the British Challenger beat the US Challenge by about 2 days. And as you can imagine, bearing in mind it was London that they were coming into, there was a lot of happiness and jubilation that they had. But they thundered down through the South China Seas into the Indian Ocean. They raced around the southern tip of Africa at the Cape of Good Hope. Then it was north across the vast Atlantic, past the Azores, through the English Channel, and into the Thames estuary, from there where they were towed up the Thames by tugs. Clipper races quickly caught the public's attention and their imagination. The speed and the rivalry were thrilling, while the ships themselves were, well, frankly, as beautiful as they were fast. They'd sail past certain marker points, messages would be communicated, riders would be sent on ahead to tell which ship was where and how they were positioning as they passed various points on the shore or along the river. And clipper races became one of the major opportunities for gambling in the time. But the reign of the Clippers was to prove quite brief. Glorious, but brief. In November 1869, the Suez Canal opened, creating a navigable passage between Asia and the Mediterranean. Now, we know very well at the moment the impact of closing the Suez Canal because of the unrest in that part of the world at the moment. When it was opened, it meant that steamships could carry quite a bulky cargo more easily than they could when they had to travel around Africa, because the weight of fuel slowed the ships down and limited the amount of cargo that they could carry if they were going to travel all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope and round into the Indian Ocean. Cutting through the Suez Canal made it possible for steamships to compete with the clippers. One great tea clipper has survived, and it's in dry dock at Greenwich in the east of London. This is the Cutty Sark, which was launched on the River Clyde near Glasgow in November 1869. One of the last tea clippers to be constructed. It was built for John Whitehat Willis, and she was intended to win the annual clipper race. In fact, she never beat her rival, Thermopylae. The deadline of the ships led to too many challenges. The steamships brought in new opportunities, and we saw the decline of the tea clipper. Now, Cutty Sark is really quite a small ship when you look at her. She couldn't quite fit in here, but she's an awful lot smaller than the sort of ships that we're used to travelling on today. And you can imagine, if you just think back to Monday and the journey on the tender back from Oak Bluffs to the ship, imagine doing that constantly through bad weather on a ship that was just a few thousand tons. You were in for a tough time. Now, going back to the story of tea and back in time, tea requires cooler nights and it requires rainfall. It's a little bit like wine. Wine requires hot days, cool nights to produce the very best wine, and that's sort of true of tea as well. And here you can see the traditional way of carrying tea down from the hills, because tea was grown and still is today up in hill country where they can guarantee cooler nights. Language wasn't the major obstacle for doing business with the Chinese. The biggest obstacle was currency, because the goods that the British had to offer China had no appeal to them. They weren't allowed to sell woolen cloth, for example, because the only people who would want woolen cloth were those up in the north of the country who the government in Beijing weren't interested in at all, and people in the south had no need of woolen cloth, so that was out. Porcelain didn't attract them because, of course, they had some of the very best porcelain manufacture in the world. And so what happened was that they introduced silver as a means of exchange. And they did this by buying the tea with silver, which would then be used to pay for the opium that Britain was bringing in from the Indian subcontinent and the countries behind. And then that same silver would be used to buy the tea, which would then be used to buy the opium. The silver never left the safes in Canton, but it was a legitimate means of payment. So the beverage that the people of North America and Europe were urged to drink in the name of temperance, so avoiding alcohol by drinking tea, was purchased at the price of drug addiction on the other side of the world. Because having addicted the greater part of the English-speaking world to tea, the British East India Company proceeded to addict its Chinese tea suppliers to another of its large commodities, and that is opium. opium grown in India and in the countries around. It was all but unknown in China until the 1600s, when the Dutch introduced one of the most evil cultural exchanges in history. Opium from the Middle East met the native American tobacco pipe in China, and tea was exchanged for the opium. China was soon growing tobacco, but it was only a matter of time before the Chinese demanded more and more and more opium at any cost. And thanks to its control of India, the company had the monopoly on it. This was before the days of electronic banking, so as I say, silver was the means of payment, and the silver basically just circulated without actually being moved at all. Sluggishly, the Emperor of China started to react. What was happening was ignored for too long. It was embarrassing, and it was effectively brushed under the carpet. They didn't want to talk about it. But finally, the emperor and his court started to try to react. They forbade the import of opium in 1800 under quite severe penalties, and the only result of that was that the trade continued, but undercover. And so the one loser out of all of that was the emperor, because people weren't paying taxes on the goods that were still being imported, just as they were before. Instead of ships coming into Canton Harbour to unload opium, they were unloading on an island in the harbour, and the opium was then being brought in by small boats, usually under cover of darkness. The Chinese called opium foreign mud, and there is no doubt that it corrupted many of their people. And even when Chinese started to come to Europe and America, many of them who came were already addicted to opium. Hence, we hear of the opium dens in London's Docklands area. It wasn't something that was natural to the Chinese. It was something that we introduced to them. Now, to be fair, anyone being fair-minded would have to acknowledge that Britain did try other ways to acquire tea. They tried more conventional trading techniques, and the diplomatic efforts continued. But the Chinese regarded them just as barbarians from abroad. They weren't interested in any tribute with the partners. Now, this illustration is called The Reception. It's a caricature of the reception that Lord Macartney received from the Keelong Emperor, and it was drawn by the famous political cartoonist James Gilray. The concession the British wanted most was for the emperor either to accept other ways of payment, or, failing that, to legalize opium. And that wasn't going to happen. Steadfastly, one after another, the emperors refused to do this. So the British response was to corrupt the imperial customs by cutting its officials in on their constantly more profitable drug traffic. In the late 1820s, the company was conniving at the export of fewer than 10,000 cases of opium annually to China. By 1870, this had risen to over 100,000. And the supply into the US the supply of tea into the US continued to be managed in London. The Chinese perfected the art of self-deception, while every one of their officials was in on the racket, from the meanest mandarin to the emperor's viceroy. Tens of thousands of chests of opium passed through their hands each season. But to quote J.M. Scott, of the tea being drunk in the West, at genteel homes in New England and at chapels in cities and towns, nearly all of it was bought by London-based traders with opium. Canton's coastal location made smuggling easy for the British traders. They'd transfer the goods to smaller boats, they could make it up the coast much more easily, there was always someone there to help them bring in the drugs. But British law-breaking hadn't gone unnoticed, and in 1839, Emperor Daogong declared a war on drugs. The Opium War of 1839 was effectively no more than a skirmish between the British authorities and ships wanting to trade cargoes other than opium. For foreign ships to be allowed to dock in Canton for trade, the Chinese authorities required a signed bond by the master of the ship confirming that they would not trade in opium. The chief superintendent of British trade in China ordered British ships not to sign the bond because it stated that were they discovered to be carrying opium, they would be subject to the death penalty. All sides knew that a major crisis was coming. The British weren't worried because they were quite sure that China was too weak to actually do anything. The Chinese weren't worried because they believed themselves invincible. So both were arrogant and unrealistic. The Second Opium War, which came in 1840, was to undermine China's illusions. They soon discovered that the West was stronger than they thought they were. American traders were frustrated as they saw Britain's influence on the trade as blocking their own ability to totally control their supply and broader trade. And the traders in the 13 factories' warehouses were locked in by Chinese army and forced to surrender. Goods with a value of some $4 million were seized, including 42,000 opium pipes and 20,000 chests of opium. Incensed by the seizures, William Jardine, the insurer and financier from the City of London, was determined to overcome this. He went back to London and lobbied his friend, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, to strike back at China. Gladstone and Disraeli argued the morals of the trade in Parliament, but with opium responsible for a significant part of British India's tax revenue, it didn't take long for the government to send in the Navy. In June 1840, the British fleet of 16 warships and 27 transports carried 4,000 men into the Pearl River Delta near to Humen. Among them was the Nemesis. This was a new iron warship armed with a deadly weapon, the Congreve rocket launcher. It was able to fire explosive rockets up to a distance of 2 miles. You can just see her at the back of this illustration. The Chinese were prepared, but their antiquated defences just had no opportunity. There were no match for the British. Now the British were supported by the French in this conflict as well. The static cannons, the armada of war junks, were destroyed in just 5.5 hours. And over the next 2 years, the British Navy travelled up the coast towards Shanghai. Chinese troops, many of whom were addicted to opium themselves, were overwhelmed at every stage. The British bombardments resulted in a considerable loss of life. Between 20 and 25,000 Chinese were killed. Britain lost 69 men. The war was quite speedily concluded with the Treaty of Nanking. This was in 1842. It was dictated at the point of a few thousand British bayonets. China was forced to accept free trade, dismantling forever the cumbersome Cohong system, recognizing foreign consuls and setting a single low tariff on all imports, whatever they might be. 4 more Chinese ports were opened up to foreigners, and Hong Kong, across Canton Bay from Macau, was ceded to the British by way of reparations, along with the enormous sum of 6 million US dollars. Other Western powers soon exacted similar privileges for themselves. Portugal acquired Macau, and in Shanghai, the European powers and the US were established in colonial trade. If European imperialism prevailed against the loudly cried yellow peril, it awakened the Asians to a cruel sense of white disaster. British troops were to invade repeatedly, burning the Summer Palace in Peking, forcing imperial legalization of opium in 1857. The legacy of the Opium Wars was profound. The Chinese Empire was shattered. They closed in on themselves against the rest of the world. They gave 5 ports to foreign trade. They paid 21 million silver dollars to the British government as compensation for loss of opium earnings and the cost of the war. But for the British, the highlight of the deal was the acquisition of Hong Kong, which they held on to for over 150 years, used as a hub in those days to increase the trade in opium with China. In some ways, tea was the petroleum industry of its day. Questionable trading, questionable military intervention, questionable economics were employed to give us our afternoon cup of what Cockneys would call a cup of Rosy Lee. But in Britain, it recognized the need to reduce the dependence on China. And so seeds were smuggled out of China to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to India, both now famous for their own blends and styles of tea that appeal to the Western market. And then, as demand required a bigger supply to quench the thirst of a growing number of regular tea drinkers, the colonial power looked to other territories to create new and even larger plantations. By the 1914 outbreak of the First World War, tea was firmly established as a refreshment of choice among all the social classes in British society and was gaining in popularity across Europe and across the Atlantic. Between 1789 and the middle of the last century, there were 4 attempts to set up tea production, large-scale tea production, in the Carolinas. Each ended up not because of commercial failure, but in each case because of the death of the founder before the business was established. In 1987, Mac Fleming, a manager at Lipton, and his partner Bill Hall, who was a third-generation tea taster in England, purchased a 127-acre tea farm in order to create the Charleston Tea Plantation. And together they created the brand known as American Classic Tea, which still is blended today. Their partnership dissolved, and in 2003 the property ended up at auction, where it was likely to fall into the hands of property developers. But at this point, Hall joined forces with R.C. Bigelow, the Connecticut-based company well known in almost every American grocery store, and they bought back the farm. The company continues to grow, continues to sell Fleming and Hall's original blend of American Classic Tea, and it remains the only black tea commercially produced in the United States. British Empire colonies were also perfect grounds for tea plantations. Countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was known, Malawi, or Nyasaland as it was, Southern Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, Uganda, they all became major producers and exporters of tea. And conditions on the plantations, frankly, were shameful in places. They certainly weren't of the best, but the people sitting in tea rooms in London and elsewhere were totally unaware of the conditions of the workers who were producing their daily cuppa. Orthodox tea refers to either hand-processed tea or tea that is rolled with machinery in a way that mimics hand-rolled tea. Most specialty teas are made with orthodox production methods, generally known for a more nuanced and complex tea. All whole leaf tea is made with orthodox production methods, and the largest producers in Africa of tea are Cameroon, Kenya and Malawi. Now South Africa is among the countries that produces different types of infusion. Rooibos, for example, red bush tea, is not of the classic chamomile varieties. And increasingly we get to drink mint tea, chamomile rather than dried tea itself, so of the same genus but of a different strain. And various fruit teas are increasingly popular today. And of course, this delightful cuppa has a lot to answer for. We all, no, maybe not we all, perhaps it's just Kathy and me, we seek out afternoon tea when we go to grand cities and there are grand hotels. And of course, we have the opportunity for afternoon tea here on board. I'd like to leave you with one thought. This is from Susan Sontag, and she says, I haven't been everywhere, but it's on my list. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be back here at 6 o'clock the day after tomorrow. So as we leave Halifax, so cocktail time, we will have drinks for you to enjoy, while I talk about European emigration and the impact of those people as they move around the world on life today. And I have a couple of other talks coming up, one about the explorers and one about the days of the grand ocean liners. But for now, I have overrun, but I will be here and very happy to answer questions. But I think I need to free up the theatre for Bong and everyone to be getting on with. But Kathy and I are around if you have any questions. Thank you for joining me.